Hi everybody, Tim Hughes here. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DLA Ignite. With me today I've got Guy Rubin, who's the CEO of Ebsta. And we're going to talk about relationships in sales, why they're so important. We're also going to dive into a whole big benchmark that Guy's and his team have put together in terms of what selling looks like right now. And for me, it is really interesting in terms of the figures that they've come up with. Guy, where can people find you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Tim. Really a big fan of the podcast. So yes, if people want to reach out to me, the easiest way of doing that is on LinkedIn. And if you mention the podcast, I'll definitely accept the invite. Always happy to talk about anything to do with either sales or data. And if you can combine the two, then you won't stop me talking.
So just give us the high level. So you've done this is the this research that you've done. Go through that in terms of the number of people that you've been talking to and etc.
Yeah, sure. So this is the fourth year we've run the B2B benchmark report. Those that are watching or listening to the podcast, you can download it for free. There's a banner at the top of ebsta.com for that.
It's in the show notes as well.
And it's in the show notes. Great. So I'd encourage your listeners to take advantage of that. This year, we analysed just over 650,000 opportunities, representing nearly $50 billion worth of pipeline. The data was sourced from about 387 existing customers of Ebsta, but also for the first time this year, we also surveyed just over 2,000 CROs and VPs of sales. So lots of data as to what's been going on in the market over the last 12 months.
So there's some high-level figures that I wanted to walk through, and I may have these. So win rates are down. Win rates are down. Is that by 10%?
Yeah. So look, when we look at the data, 2023 was a tough old year for most businesses.
Yeah.
And we saw win rates drop dramatically that year. For I think it was 18% drop.
In 2024, you saw an 18% drop. Yeah.
Yes. Now, when we look at the 2025 data now, we've seen, it feels like we've hit the bottom and we're on the way up again. So while the numbers really were dramatically bad in the first half of the year, last year, as we kind of ended 2024 and into 2025, we can see that the win rates are starting to pick up, and over the whole 12-month period, they're still slightly down, but things like average deal size has grown dramatically. We've seen a big push for businesses to move up market. Average deal values have gone up by 54% on average, and we also saw the average deal time to close reduce again. Number of stakeholders.
So it was interesting that in 2024 the average deal values went down by 21%, but in 2025 they've gone up by 54%.
Yeah, massive swings here. We saw kind of end of 2023, beginning of 2024, we saw there was a lot of discounting going on. People doing pretty much anything they could to get a deal over the line. Obviously, at some point, the leaderships of these businesses decided they needed to put their quotas back up to where they needed to be. And there seems to be a much more alignment now between sales and marketing, and a lot more focus on the right ICP and larger deals. So average deal values jumped, off the back of them falling dramatically. They've come back and with some gusto. So average deal values went up, as I say, by 54% in total over the year.
And sales cycles?
Down nearly 10%. So that's a good thing. So time to close actually reduced. Also, the number of stakeholders actively involved in the sales process came down again. So people are making decisions quicker, and they're not having to make every decision by committee. So that seems to be. We're entering 2025, or as we're in 2025 now, with quite a lot of momentum. It feels like there are certain areas that are still being disrupted, especially with, dare I say, the tariffs. But actually, we're seeing a lot more focus on larger opportunities, sales cycles reducing, and deals are being done.
Then go on to the some of the interesting ones, which is that 78% of salespeople miss quota, whereas back in 2024 it was 69%.
Yeah, well, 69%, even that was insanely high for me, in my opinion. So getting to 78% of sellers not consistently hitting quota is a really scary data point. And in fact, as we dive into that, what we find is that just 14% of sellers are responsible for 80% of new logo revenue last year. And that's the smallest percentage we've ever seen. So the delta between our top performing sellers and everybody else is getting wider, not shorter. And we saw that with that velocity delta. The delta between top and bottom performers last year grew to 11x. Now, I think that number is probably slightly exacerbated because we saw so much churn in sales teams last year.
And what do you mean by the velocity delta being 11x?
So sales velocity is a great data point to be able to compare apples with apples. So if you've got sellers selling into different markets, different geographies, maybe different deal sizes, distilling that down to kind of a dollars per day return for each seller is a great way of trying to work out which sellers or which markets are giving you the best return. So just because the deals are big, if they take too long or the win rates are too low, then actually you may get a much better bang for your buck on a much more transactional model. So we lean into that data point around sales velocity quite a lot. And then when we look at the delta between what the top performers are achieving versus the average seller, that delta is now 11x. But as I was saying, that number's been skewed slightly. We saw nearly a third of sellers churn last year.
Wow.
And so with so much churn, there's obviously a ramp time to get the new sellers in and up and running and performing. So while I think that number is still unacceptably high, actually I think in reality we'll find that number comes down this year.
Okay. And you also talk about ongoing engagement driving 1.9x expansion potential. So when you're going into account and selling, I guess it's a land and expand.
Well, we saw a big shift this year into what we call kind of full sales cycle selling. So when I started in sales, we were responsible for generating our own leads.
I was, yeah. Well, I still am.
Well, there we go. As am I. So then we run our own sales cycle, but also retaining the customer after we've done the deal. So there's obviously benefits to that model, but we then transition to this kind of Salesforce approach to life, wherever you have these kind of specialist single-purpose vehicles that just do a piece of the puzzle. And while in theory that's a great idea, the problem is it doesn't really serve the buyer. The buyer builds a relationship with a particular seller, and then all of a sudden they get to a point where that relationship is strong enough to sign a contract. And of course, then they get handed over, and the handovers are rarely as good as they should be. And so we've seen a big push for sellers to be responsible for generating more of their own pipeline, but also holding on to the account for longer as well. And that generates some really interesting outcomes, because obviously the buyer gets much more consistency in their experience, but the seller doesn't now need to sell the whole deal in the first instance. They're quite happy to get a smaller deal signed quicker, and then they can do the cross-sell, upsell, over the first 6, 9, 12 months. So I think it serves everyone. And if you ask me, we saw, I think it was over 40% of organizations are moving towards that model. And I think if you look at this time next year, that number will be even higher.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because you say that there's 46% of people are now using a full cycle sales model, and you actually talk about that's now the go-to-market model for top performing companies.
Yeah, I think every business is slightly different, and again, I'm not suggesting there isn't a role for SDRs or BDRs in the market and marketing, of course. I just think that sellers have a response, that the top performers can sniff out their own opportunities. They're really good at identifying those ICP deals, and I think that's one of the other, lots of data points in the report, but one of the things we talk a little bit about is ICP. And I think one of the challenges organizations have, especially when they miss quota, maybe the year before, is they just think that the answer to everything is just to pump marketing. And the problem there, of course, is you might generate a whole lot more leads, but that doesn't mean you're going to generate more ICP leads. And while the top performers don't mind that, they can sniff out the ones that work. The B and C players have a real challenge because they just end up working the lead that they're given. And more often than not, in fact, the percentage of leads coming in that match ICP is now the smallest percentage we've ever seen.
Yeah, we see a lot of organizations where because the leads that they're getting are so rubbish that they're they've got to win everything. So what they do is that they train people to close on a sales methodology to close what are ultimately rubbish deals, which doesn't work. So they're kind of looking at the wrong thing rather than looking at generating conversations. They're trying to close the rubbish they've got. What makes a top performer more effective?
Oh wow, that's a big question. So we've done a lot of analysis on what the top performers are doing. In fact, our ICP are businesses where maybe 20% of the sellers are consistently hitting quota, and then you've kind of got this long tail of underperforming sellers. And what we spend a lot of time doing is building benchmarks. And the challenge people have with building those benchmarks is that the data, usually in Salesforce these days, the data in Salesforce is incomplete and inconsistent because it only got there by the seller manually putting it in. So we have an engine that connects to our customers' mail servers, their calendars, their phone systems, and we go back through all the deals that closed won and lost in the past and try and find all the missing activities and contacts associated to those deals. So before Ebsta, you might look at an old deal that closed won or lost and see that it's got one contact and 3 emails. Once we've finished our process, every single one of those deals that closed won or lost, you'll see that actually the buying committee might have been 9 stakeholders and there were 250 interactions during a 5-stage sales process. So by doing the work to fix the data, suddenly we're now able to build benchmarks in a way that no one else has done before. And we can use those benchmarks to explain or show or create pictures to highlight what the top performers are doing at every stage of the sales cycle. So for example, if your average seller might have 3 stakeholders actively involved during a sales cycle, but your top performer might have 6, with one of them being the finance persona by stage 2. Now, if we know that we need an engagement of 67 or above with the finance persona and an average of 6 stakeholders actively involved by stage 2, we can start to change the gates and triggers around the stages and not allow the B and C players to leave stage 2 unless they've achieved that certain milestone. And so our job as leaders is to introduce that level of consistency, not just in the way the sellers are doing what they're doing, but actually real granularity of consistency around the way we do our pipeline inspection, the way we ask the right questions, and really get the sellers thinking in the way that's going to help them to win most.
Because you say in the data, when decision makers are actively involved in the first 2 stages of the sales process, win rates rose by 55%.
Yeah, so now different organizations will need different decision makers, but I know, for example, in our business, if we don't get the finance persona actively involved until we're presenting back the solution, our win rates are dramatically lower. But if we can get them involved in building the business case in the first place, our win rates are higher. So now, if the seller has to have a difficult conversation with their champion and say, look, I really want to go down this journey with you, but I'm not allowed to leave this stage unless you allow me access to the finance persona. And by having that strong conversation, it allows us to close off deals lost that are never going to go anywhere anyway. But also it helps the buyer to understand. We're the experts at helping them to buy, and we need to guide them through that process. And the way we do that as leaders is by educating our sellers as to what good looks like at every stage. And that could be making sure we're targeting ICP. It could be down to qualification. It could be down to how multi-threaded we are. And in an AI world, B2B sales is still very much driven by relationships. And we know relationships drive revenue. But understanding which personas are giving you the right outcomes is absolutely key.
Because you then go on to say that top performers are more focused on multi-threading, building stakeholder trust. So I'm guessing what you're saying, and the whole point of this podcast is that relationships and trust matter.
Oh, incredibly much now. I think you can take it at every stage. We saw the best quality leads are coming through introductions or partners or ecosystem and community. So that kind of makes sense, right? We trust people that introduce us to opportunities. Then when you think about the buying process or the discovery stages, again, the top performers are having conversations with the customer about what other projects they've got on right now and where this sits on their priority, and almost using the takeaway to say, look, maybe this is something we should revisit in 6 months' time, but when you're ready, I'm here to support you as your subject matter expert. While the B and C players are, talking about the football or the weather, and then, right now, sit down, shut up, let me show you how the buttons work. And that doesn't serve anybody. So, building that persona up as the expert advisor in the space, helping your buyers to be able to make the right decisions, perhaps even holding back and helping them to prioritize other things. Because frankly, eventually they're going to stop the project anyway if they don't have it as a priority. But really digging into what's going on in their world and really understanding what is it that's going to get them their next promotion? What is it that's going to get them to win whatever it is that they're trying to achieve? It is so much more important than showing them how the buttons work.
So you also say top teams close deals 3 times faster.
Time kills all deals. And if you don't know how many days your team spend in each stage when they win versus when they lose, you're missing a big trick. We see it time and again. We went into a customer the other day. They had 120 deals that had slipped by more than 180 days. Now, their win rates were less than 5% on those once we'd seen slippage of 180 days, but they were still holding on to these deals on hope rather than expectation.
Yeah.
And once you show them the data, once they can see, look, when you see that level of slippage, this isn't going anywhere, right? And actually, if we can clear out the pipeline, suddenly we're freed up to do something more productive. You know, last year, only 19% of opportunities closed one. Okay, so we're spending 80% of our time on opportunities that aren't going to go anywhere. So as leaders, if we can help our sellers to understand that and show them the leading indicators, and time is a big one, a big leading indicator. So you should be looking at average sales cycles. You should be looking at slippage. So if deals start to slip past their anticipated close date after you've got an anticipated close date, so after discovery and you've locked in a buying process, if they start to slip materially, what impact does that have on win rates? All the data's in your systems. You know, you just need to be able to extract it and do the analysis. And then finally, if you can get down to individual stages, understanding the number of days you spend in stage when you win versus when you lose gives you the power to show the seller why they should close things off as lost sooner.
And a conversation about sales wouldn't be right nowadays without a conversation about AI. You say that 81% of companies are using AI in some shape or form, which kind of doesn't surprise me. It does surprise me what the other 19 are doing. But it's one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that there's this old thing, isn't there, that in sales, which is I don't spend enough time selling. You know, I'm doing admin or I'm doing whatever. But you actually say that salespeople that are using AI end up sellers. Let me read what you said. Sellers spend twice the time selling. So you're actually using AI. You're freeing up the salespeople to sell.
Yeah, look, AI is really bad at building relationships and trust with our buyers.
Absolutely,
right?
Yes.
But it's really good at admin. And it just so happens that sellers are really good at building relationships with buyers. And more often than not, they're pretty bad at admin. So when you combine the two, you can achieve very special things. Now, I'm not an expert at top of funnel AI tools. I know some of our team use some really great tools to help them with their crafting their messages. But when I think about the AI we have in our platform, what we're interested in doing is consistently recording the activities and the engagement that's going on with the customers. And if you take, for example, a qualification methodology, and we should be qualifying not just in the discovery stage and not even just through the whole sales cycle, but actually through the whole customer life cycle. Qualification is a key component. Now, where AI can step in is taking things like your phone call recordings or your Zoom recordings, and taking those transcripts and having a consistent approach to capturing things like how well you've qualified the customer, scoring that qualification, understanding which competitors are being mentioned, what objections are being raised, and recording that back in Salesforce in a consistent format. And again, uniquely to us, we were able to actually go through the last year or two's worth of call recordings, if you've got them, and go back and retrospectively tell you how well or badly you qualified deals that closed won and lost in the past. And what's fascinating when you do that is you find there's a whole host of sellers that are losing deals at late stage when you think it's a late stage sales problem, and in fact it's not. It turns out they never qualified the customers well enough in the first place. And you can do that analysis. Going through 1,000 hours of call recordings is just impossible, but the AI can do it in a day. And it can go back historically and tell us, look, you're really good at the med, but you're really bad at the pick. We need to do some training here. And the skill set required to qualify customers correctly is a really powerful skill set, but it's very different to the skill set required to record that information consistently in the system of record. And so what we need to do is focus on teaching our sellers how to engage and clarify and qualify. But we can allow the AI, because it's so much better and so much more consistent at doing that, recording it in the system of record and scoring that qualification. And customers that have got that in place are now able to use that as a gate and say, look, I'm sorry, you're not allowed past this part of the sales cycle unless we've achieved a certain score on key components of your medic or your band or your spice.
And we've had a comment from Andrew Slesser, who's a big watcher of ours, which he says, with all the technology and AI systems at everyone's fingertips, personal interaction is still key to gain the top sales.
Yeah, relationships drive revenue, even in 2025, certainly in B2B sales. And in fact, maintaining those relationships, not just up to the sales cycle, but actually beyond is absolutely key. And some of the data we saw around cross-sells and renewals was really fascinating. So if in the last 2 QBRs before your renewal are done at the C-level, you are 7 times more likely to open a cross-sell upsell opportunity. However, if you're doing those QBRs below the C-suite, you are 4 times more likely to churn your customer.
Wow.
So knowing which personas your CS team are engaging with, understanding what level of value they're adding, and remember, a QBR is not an opportunity to talk about making sure things are connected correctly or getting the admin right. A QBR is a strategic session with the customer, and if your C levels are not turning up to the QBRs, it's your fault. You're not delivering enough value. It's not strategic enough, and so rethink how you engage with the C-suite, because it will transform your retention and your cross-sell upsell opportunities.
Excellent. Guy, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your research. It's fascinating, and it's been great fun digging into it and reading it, and it's been great fun you coming on and talking about it. Thank you so much. Where can people find you?
Well, as I say, I love talking about data. I love talking about sales. So if you want to reach out and talk about your benchmarks or how you benchmark against the industry, always happy to have those conversations. You can find me on LinkedIn, and if you mention the podcast, I'll definitely accept the invite.
Guy, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks.